Part 26. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 251. Valia said, I named it a dematerializer, which can remove matter. However, the performance of the dematerializer that my astronomical computer can write is limited. It can only remove the third-generation genome, and no higher. Can only remove the third-generation genome. Chen Tao looked at Valia and said, have you shown this thing to Katie? Valia shook her head and said, no. Chen Tao smiled, fortunately you didn't show it to her, otherwise my thing would probably have a big impact on her. Well, I think so too, Valia said, before you and the enemies from the outer universe appeared, the third-generation genome was a godlike existence in this universe, and Katie and others believed that the third-generation genome was completely unkillable. But now there is a weapon that can make the third-generation genome disappear directly. Chen Tao nodded slightly. It seems that Valia also has a certain understanding of Katie. Chen Tao didn't think much and said, then make it according to your size. Well, Valia nodded slightly. Time stopped passing. The surroundings turned into blue codes. You've entered the inner world again, Betty's voice. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and he looked at Betty. Betty's hand was still holding Chen Tao's fingers, and her big eyes were looking at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, well, I need to write it, wait for me. Betty pouted, she took back her hand, crossed her chest, and stood aside to watch. Is this your inner world? A voice came from the side. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Valia. Valia was looking around with her hands crossed. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled bitterly and said, after programming your armor into immune analysis, my inner world doesn't seem to work for you. Valia looked at Chen Tao, she smiled and said, isn't this good? This means that your programming is useful. Chen Tao could only smile. Chen Tao threw the beads he got from Valia. Because the beads were in blue code mode, they were suspended in the air after being thrown out. Chen Tao said, Xingyuan wrote a program that can completely analyze the fifth-generation genome according to the size and shape of the bead. My request is to use this bead to analyze and erase the fifth-generation genome. Can you do it? Received the instruction, writing. A mechanical voice sounded. Hearing Xingyuan's familiar voice, Chen Tao understood. Since it can be written, it means it can be done. A weapon that can analyze the fifth-generation gene that can be carried on the body is simply a nightmare for the fifth-generation genome. Why didn't Chen Tao think of making such a weapon at that time? Chen Tao crossed his arms and said slowly, it seems that my imagination is not as rich as Valia's. Compilation is complete. Only 3 minutes later, Xingyuan's voice sounded. Chen Tao said, copy 3000. Although Valia said that it doesn't need to be too big, of course the more weapons, the better, and this thing doesn't take up space. Copying. Under Chen Tao's gaze, another spherical substance with a blue code was copied, and it didn't take long. 3000 dematerializers appeared. Copying completed. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao moved his mind, and the 3000 blue spheres fell from midair to the ground and were placed. Time resumed. Looking at the 3000 dematerializers on the ground, Chen Tao looked at Valia and said, this should be enough. Valia nodded slightly and said, I will use them well. Chen Tao looked at Valia in front of him. Valia was wearing armor, a golden cloak, and her hair was tied up. She was tall and exuded the aura of a king. Looking at this charming woman, Chen Tao slowly approached and his big hand fell on her cheek. Valia looked at Chen Tao's eyes. Chen Tao leaned down and kissed her lips. After a long time, they slowly separated. Valia's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes, with a hint of confusion in her big eyes. Chen Tao said softly, I'm going to the fifth universe next. I'll leave the things here to you. Valia pursed her lips, and suddenly moved, hugged Chen Tao with her hands, and threw her body into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He came back to his senses, slowly hugged her, and gently stroked her back. Chen Tao's eyes became gentle. She was a queen, but in front of Chen Tao, she was still a woman who needed to be loved and pampered. It's just that Valia is not used to showing her weak side, which makes her look so indifferent and unattainable. Chen Tao pulled Valia's hand away, and he stretched out his big hand and picked Valia up horizontally. Valia was slightly startled, her eyes were shining, and she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao raised his hand, and there was a big bed in the warehouse. Valia's eyes trembled slightly. Chen Tao put her on the bed. Betty next to him saw this scene, her little face blushed, opened a micro wormhole, and left. An hour later, Chen Tao lay on the bed, looking at the ceiling of the warehouse, and then looked at Valia beside him. Valia closed her eyes, lying on her side, with her head resting on Chen Tao's arm. Chen Tao turned his face slightly and slowly kissed her forehead. Feeling Chen Tao's move, Valia slowly opened her eyes. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Okay, I should go deal with other things." She got out of bed. Chen Tao looked at Valia's slender back. He stood up and hugged her gently. Feeling her small body, he kissed her golden hair and said softly, "Don't work too hard. Sometimes you need to relax properly." Valia's eyes were shining. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "I can only relax when I'm with you. Except when I'm with you, I only think about dealing with problems or fighting." Chen Tao was slightly startled. Perhaps, this is why Valia is a natural leader. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Find a time to let you have a child and take care of your child." Valia blushed slightly, looked at Chen Tao and said, "If there is, let's talk about it later." Valia stood up, put on her armor, looked at Chen Tao reluctantly, and then left. Chen Tao also got off the bed and put on his clothes. He looked around, "Where's Betty?" His eyebrows slightly relaxed and said, "Xingyun, search for Betty's location." Received the order, searching. Search successful, Red Dragon King Betty, located at the residence of the former Dragon King Kadi. Upon hearing, Chen Tao's pupils condensed slightly. Betty is at Kadi's residence. Those two women are incompatible, what will happen if they meet? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 252. Time goes back to when Betty just left. After Betty left the warehouse, she appeared on the streets of Dragon City. She walked on the street, looking at the buildings where the dragons lived next to her. She felt a little nostalgic. Although millions of years have passed, the architectural culture of the dragons has been passed down. These architectural styles are exactly the style of Betty's era. Betty looked at the buildings in front of her, her eyes were shining, and she couldn't help but fall into memories. As the king of the Red Dragon clan, Betty was entrusted with an important task by Kadi in Dragon City, but because she and Kadi had different ideas, conflicts continued. Over time, Betty thought about overthrowing Kadi's rule by force. Who knew that her technology was much weaker than Kadi's? Not only did she lose, but she was also exiled to a distant and desolate planet. She spent millions of years researching new technologies, thinking that she could fight back to Dragon City and pull Kadi down. But now, her army is scattered. And she followed Chen Tao and became Chen Tao's woman. Thinking of this, Betty's eyes shone with a gleam. When she was with Chen Tao, she was always bullied, but when she was with Chen Tao, Betty found that it was the happiest thing in her life, this long life. That kind of joy is something that is hard to explain. When she was with him, she could always forget everything. The only thing she could care about was Chen Tao's tenderness towards her. Thinking of Chen Tao, Betty couldn't help but think of what happened between Chen Tao and Valia just now. When she thought of this, Betty puffed her cheeks and said, "You are so intimate with other women in front of me, bastard." She was jealous, but Betty would never admit it. Well, What a cute little girl! Suddenly, a voice came. Betty was slightly startled. She looked at the source of the voice beside her and saw a beautiful face. The person who came was Bai Yao. Seeing Bai Yao, Betty was slightly startled. Bai Yao squatted down and looked at Betty. She smiled and said, "I remember you. You are the girl next to Chen Tao." When the tall Bai Yao squatted down, she was exactly the same height as Betty. Betty was slightly startled. She frowned and said nothing. Bai Yao looked at Betty's eyes with a gleam in them. She smiled and said, "Why don't you speak?" "Well, I know. Are you a little scared of strangers? Then let me introduce myself. My name is Bai Yao. I am a friend of the man next to you. You don't have to be afraid. I won't hurt you." Betty snorted, turned her face away, and said, "I know you." Bai Yao looked at Betty with a puffed face, her arms around her chest, and an unhappy look on her face. Betty looked at her and smiled instead. So cute. This cute loli with red hair, red eyes, small arms and legs was so cute when she was angry that it made people kiss her. Bai Yao's eyes lit up. Bai Yao smiled and said, "You heard it from Chen Tao, right? In that case, you should know that I'm not a bad person." Betty opened her little lips and wanted to speak, but then she thought that if she revealed her identity in front of Bai Yao, it would definitely be troublesome. She closed her little mouth and was too lazy to explain. But in Bai Yao's opinion, this was equivalent to Betty's tacit consent. Bai Yao smiled and said, "You are so cute, can I touch you?" No. Betty puffed her face and glanced at Bai Yao. This woman, what's wrong? Bai Yao thought about it, and she said, "I remember you seem to like steak very much, so, how about this, I'll give you steak, and you let me touch it?" Betty was stunned. She looked at Bai Yao with her ruby-like eyes and said, "Is there steak here?" She couldn't help swallowing her saliva and pursing her thin lips. "The steak from Dragon City? Will it be better than the one on Earth?" Bai Yao nodded and said with a smile, "Of course, is it okay?" Betty hesitated and thought about it. Before, Betty was in Dragon City, mainly because of the conflict with Katie. Bai Yao had no intersection with her, and no conflict. It's okay to be touched by her, after all, they are all women. "And steak?" Betty said, "Okay, you give me steak, and I'll let you touch it." Bai Yao smiled and raised her hand. She saw the gloves on her hands. She blinked and took off the gloves. Then put them on Bai Yao's little head. Bai Yao stroked it, and she looked very happy. "Your hair is so soft, it feels so small." "Okay." Betty said, "Where's my steak?" Bai Yao looked at Betty with a red face, a little embarrassed. Bai Yao smiled, she took her hand back, and said, "Let's go, I'll take you to eat." As she said that, Bai Yao raised her hand and opened a micro wormhole. Without further ado, Bai Yao took Betty's hand and led her into the micro wormhole. When entering the micro wormhole, the eyes went dark at first, and then suddenly brightened. This was in a living room. The living room decoration was in the style of the dragon culture, all white and looked more luxurious. Betty looked around, and suddenly her ruby-like eyes condensed slightly, because she saw a woman sitting on the sofa. Katie. Katie was wearing a nightgown, crossing her legs, with her arms around her chest, looking at the blue screen in front of her. It seems that she is watching TV to kill time. Feeling someone coming, Katie looks over here. Katie's eyebrows are slightly relaxed, she looks at Bai Yao, smiles, and suddenly her eyes fall on Betty. The four eyes meet. Katie is slightly startled, looks at Bai Yao, and says, "Why did you bring her here?" Bai Yao smiles and says, "I mean, haven't you been studying the food of Earth recently? There is something called steak. Can you make it? I want to try it and let her try it too." Katie's eyebrows are slightly relaxed, and she says, This is not a restaurant. Bai Yao smiles, what does it matter? When friends come to your house, of course you have to treat them with some food, right? You are now the dragon girl of a man of Earth civilization, and you have to use some of the culture there to act. Katie is slightly startled, she touches the back of her head helplessly, and says, okay, I'll go prepare it, you wait here. Or, Katie gets up and leaves. Seeing this scene, Betty is stunned. Katie, made steak for her? What's going on? Betty couldn't help but look at Bai Yao. Bai Yao smiled and said, sit anywhere, just treat this as your own home. Betty pursed her lips, she looked at Bai Yao and said, isn't Katie the Dragon King? What's wrong with her? Bai Yao blinked, she smiled, and said, she is the former Dragon King, come, sit down. Bai Yao took Betty into a bedroom and walked to the dressing table. When she heard Bai Yao say sit down, she sat in front of the dressing table. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 253. Bai Yao picked up the comb, walked behind Betty, combed Betty's hair with the comb, and said, she used to be the king of dragons, but later Chen Tao took over the position of king of dragons and left the matter to Vilya. After that, Kati felt at ease. Chen Tao told Kati that he wanted Kati to relax and enjoy life at home. Then it became what you see now. Bai Yao said, without those things about the dragon civilization, Katie wants to study some of the Earth Star's culture and make some Earth Star food. Among them is steak. Let me tell you, I have eaten steak on the Earth Star before. I've also eaten steak made by Katie. It tastes much better. Do you know why? Bai Yao smiled. The beef used by Katie is found all over the universe. It is some very delicious beef that cannot be found on the earth. Listening, Betty couldn't help but swallow her saliva, and her eyes looked at herself in the mirror. Is it so delicious? Well, you'll know in a moment, Bai Yao said with a smile. Betty pursed her lips, wondering if the chair was too high and her feet couldn't touch the ground. When her mood overcame her, she couldn't help but shake her feet slightly. For a moment, she was filled with anticipation. All right. Suddenly, Betty heard Bai Yao's voice. She was stunned for a moment. Okay, what's okay? Bai Yao had a smile on her face and said, of course her hair is combed. As she said that, she held one of Betty's ponytails in each hand and slowly pulled it away. Betty was stunned and said, what are you doing? Bai Yao relaxed his hands. A pair of ponytails hang naturally behind her back. Betty was stunned. She had just been chatting with Bai Yao about Katie, and her attention was completely attracted by the food that was about to arrive. Bai Yao actually took advantage of the time when Betty didn't react and gave Betty a pair of ponytails. Betty quickly got down from the chair. As soon as her body moved, the pair of ponytails behind her swayed. Betty turned her face sideways and looked at the ponytails behind her through the mirror. She looked at Bai Yao and said, why did you make my hair look like this? Are you a lolicon? She was so angry, her hair was fine, but this woman actually tied it into twin tails. Lolicon. Bai Yao felt his heart skip a beat. Yeah. It turns out that I am a lolicon? Betty angrily tried to untie the rope from her ponytail. Seeing this, Bai Yao quickly said, don't untie it. I want it untied, Betty yelled. When Bai Yao saw that her beloved roll was about to be destroyed, she hurriedly said, Chen Tao will see your hairstyle and like it very much. Betty slapped her hands. After Betty stopped her movements, Bai Yao's heart moved. She had a smile on her face and said, I know Chen Tao. Chen Tao will definitely like your twin tails, I promise. Betty thought that Chen Tao would like it, so she slowly retracted her hand, glanced at Bai Yao, and said, I didn't keep them for Chen Tao, I just think they look okay. Okay, no matter what, I'm going out. She took small steps out of the door and returned to the living room. She sat on the couch, leaning against it. The twin ponytails hang naturally on her slender shoulders. Paired with her petite figure, she looks even more adorable. Bai Yao walked out of the bedroom and looked at Betty sitting on the sofa, with a smile on her face. Interesting. Frankly speaking, Bai Yao had seen Betty before through the images given by the celestial computer. When she saw lowly Betty for the first time, she realized that there were such cute little things in the world. Then, I kept paying attention to Betty's every move, and the more she watched, the cuter she became. When Bai Yao met Betty, she planned to tie Betty into a double ponytail. Bai Yao is not a lolicon, she just likes cute things. After seeing the cute Betty, she wanted to make Betty cuter. It was worth it to Bai Yao to tie her into a pair of ponytails and get scolded as a Lolita by her. At this time, Katie walked out with a dinner plate. She glanced at Bai Yao and said, "Come to the dining hall, it's done." Bai Yao nodded slightly, looked at Betty and said, "Let's go." Betty's eyes lit up, and she obediently got off the sofa and ran over. When we arrived at the dining room, we sat down at the dining table. Looking at the dinner plate brought to her, Betty's eyes lit up slightly. The lid was taken off by Katie, and a rich aroma came to the face. Betty's eyes lit up. She raised her little hand, picked up the knife and fork, and cut the steak like Chen Tao did. This was Betty's first time cutting steak by herself. She had already learned how to do it because she watched Chen Tao do it up close. I just haven't been too lazy to cut it myself. Put a piece of cut beef into your mouth. It seemed to melt directly in the mouth. The tender taste and mouth-filling aroma made all the cells in Betty's body jump. Bai Yao didn't lie to her. The steak made by Katie was indeed much more delicious than the one from Dixing. It's delicious. After taking a bite, Betty couldn't help sighing, her little face was full of happiness. Katie sat aside and looked at Betty's expression. Katie couldn't help but smile. Katie had never touched kitchen utensils before, but in order to integrate into Chen Tao's world and to please Chen Tao, Katie cooked by herself. Since she started cooking, Katie has found that the greatest joy of being a chef is to see others eat what she cooks and then show a happy look. However, Katie rarely invites people to dinner. Most of the things she cooks are eaten by herself and Bai Yao. She always wants to get a good evaluation from Bai Yao, but Bai Yao is like that and can't say anything nice. But now Katie sees the happy smile on Betty's baby face that can't be concealed at all. Katie feels joy welling up in her heart. Katie smiled and said, "If you like it, eat more. After you finish eating, I will cook it for you again." Bai Yao heard it. She looked at Katie and said, "Do you want to cook it again? Why didn't I have this treatment before?" Katie looked at Bai Yao, and she said, "Your evaluation is too insincere. It's meaningless to give it to you." Bai Yao's mouth twitched, and he could only smile helplessly. "Can you cook it for me again?" Betty's eyes lit up, and she said, "Okay, I'll eat it quickly." As soon as she realized it, Betty was immediately excited. "Don't be in a hurry, eat slowly," Katie said with a smile. Suddenly, there was a figure in the dining hall. Chen Tao appeared in the dining hall. Seeing Chen Tao coming, Katie looked at Chen Tao and smiled. "You are here." Katie was not surprised by Chen Tao's arrival. It is normal for this lowly to be here and Chen Tao to be here. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at the scene in front of him and was a little confused for a while. Can anyone explain to me what is going on? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 254. Chen Tao thought that when Betty came to Katie's residence, there would definitely be a fight, but what Chen Tao never expected was the scene in front of him. 3 women sat at the dining table, eating warmly and harmoniously. This is too strange. Chen Tao's eyes couldn't help but fall on Betty and saw Betty in front of him. Chen Tao was slightly startled. Betty's long, silky fiery red hair was tied into a pair of ponytails, hanging naturally behind Betty. Paired with Betty's petite figure, these twin ponytails add a bit of cuteness to Betty. It's just, Chen Tao remembered that when Betty first came out, she didn't have twin ponytails. No wonder Betty tied herself into twin ponytails. Betty looked here, her eyes glowing. I brought her here. Bai Yao looked at Chen Tao with a smile on his face. Hearing this, Chen Tao was a little confused. He walked to Betty, raised his hand, and stroked Betty's little head habitually. Then he went down and took the opportunity to hold Betty's ponytail. He looked at Betty and said, "Why, what's going on?" Betty said, "Bai Yao brought me here, and then Bai Yao said that Katie would make steak for me to eat. I was just waiting here, and now I have steak to eat. You can also try it. Katie's steak is better than there are so many of them to eat in Earth Star." Hearing Betty's unabashed praise, Katie's eyes lit up slightly and a smile appeared on her face. Chen Tao felt shocked. Betty is the Red Dragon King, the Red Dragon King who was once expelled from Dragon City by Katie. She actually praised Katie, even though it was about her cooking skills. Chen Tao was shocked. Chen Tao looked at the steak. It seemed that this steak was very lethal to Betty. "My dear, if you want, I will prepare some for you." Katie smiled and said, "Let you have a taste of my craftsmanship." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and shook his head. No need, he was worried just now, but now it seems that he should be fine. Since it's okay, it doesn't matter. Chen Tao is not very interested in steak. Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, Are you here? Are you in a hurry?" Chen Tao doesn't come to Longren City often, and most of the time he comes to Longren City for urgent matters. But now Chen Tao doesn't even have time to eat steak, and Katie suspects that something is wrong with Chen Tao. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Katie, who nodded slightly and said, "There is indeed something going on. I plan to go to the fifth universe." Katie was slightly startled. She frowned and said, "Universe 5? Why go there?" Chen Tao said, "As soon as they come to visit us, it's time for us to visit them as well. We must reciprocate the gift. If we don't reciprocate, we can't do it." When Katie heard this, she frowned slightly, pondered for a moment, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Did they take action against Earth Star?" As far as Katie knew, Universe 5 did come a few times, but those times they always made the other party laugh and leave crying. Logically speaking, just because of those few times, with Chen Tao's character, it is impossible for Chen Tao to choose to leave his own universe and go to the fifth universe. Therefore, Katie judged that it was most likely that people from the fifth universe took action against the Earth without her knowledge. Otherwise, Chen Tao cannot be provoked to go to the other party's home to settle accounts with him. Chen Tao slowly sat on the chair, folded his hands on his chest, leaned on the back of the chair, looked at Katie, and said, "Well, the other party not only attacks the Earth, but also the solar system. For this, I specially built a galaxy defense system." "But," Chen Tao said, "even if there is a galaxy defense system, if the other party continues to come, it will be impossible to prevent it. Only by going to them and giving them a certain gift in return can we completely eradicate it." Katie said, "Well, actually, I had this idea before. Only by showing strength outside and making them afraid will they not come to bully us. It's just, if you leave this universe, I have some thoughts. I am worried that the current technology of the dragon civilization will not be able to deal with the invasion of the alien cosmic civilization in the future." Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "This is the reason why I came to Dragon City this time. I need to upgrade the armor of the soldiers, including you and Bai Yao." "Upgrade?" Katie looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao nodded slightly and said, the biggest shortcoming of the super concept armor I have given you now is that it is pulled into the other world and forcibly analyzed. Therefore, I need to upgrade your equipment to make them immune to being analyzed. Katie was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Can this be done? Can this be done? Katie was a little in disbelief. Chen Tao looked at Katie, he smiled and said, it seems it can be done so far. Hearing this, Katie breathed a sigh of relief and said, in this case, the power of our dragon civilization will be horribly improved. Indeed, in this way, even if civilizations from alien universes come over, we will still be able to fight. Chen Tao looked at Katie and said, I have just upgraded the armor of the 10 million dragons on the front line, and only the 2 of you are left. Let's get started without further delay. Katie nodded slightly. Chen Tao raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Crack. A slight sound. Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly and he said, that's it? Okay. Katie looked at the nightgown she was wearing, and then looked at Chen Tao, this. Chen Tao said, your armor is in your bedroom. I have seen it. I have upgraded it. Then, I see you wear this nightgown often, so I have redefined it. Although it is thin, it has the same function. When Katie heard it, her face blushed slightly and said, well, I know. Chen Tao slowly stood up. Seeing Chen Tao's actions, Katie said, are you leaving now? Let her finish the steak before leaving. I've finished it. Suddenly, Katie heard the voice. She was slightly startled and looked at Betty. Betty's plate was empty. Katie was startled. Katie just saw Betty take a bite. Betty said, I just finished it in the other world. It tastes so good. Katie saw the scene and felt a little disappointed. She wanted to use this time to do something, but she didn't expect it to be like this. Katie, I want more, Betty suddenly said. Hearing this voice, Katie's eyes widened, and then she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, then thank you for your help. Katie heard it, and she said, it's not a problem at all, so why don't you come too? Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly, okay. Katie got up and walked towards the kitchen. Bai Yao looked at the lovely Betty, then looked at Chen Tao and said, by the way, Chen Tao, what's her name? You haven't told us yet. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 255. Although Bai Yao couldn't help being attracted to Betty before, so he even wanted to use a computer to monitor her. But because the distance was too far, Bai Yao could only see the picture but could not hear their voices. The reason why Bai Yao knew that Betty liked steak was because she saw Chen Tao feeding Betty steak and looking at Betty's happy face, and then she judged that Betty liked steak. But Bai Yao didn't know Betty's name. What's Betty's name? Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Betty. Want to speak out? Now Betty's red hair and red eyes are very conspicuous. If Bai Yao were told Betty's real name now, it is estimated that the atmosphere will not be so harmonious next time. But if Betty's name is not mentioned and Betty is given a false name, Betty will probably be angry. Not daring to state your name in front of others is an act that hurts your self-esteem. My name is Taiwo, Betty said quickly. Upon hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty, and it was Chen Tao's turn to be surprised. Betty, the arrogant and self-respecting Red Dragon King, actually concealed her name? This is quite rare. Betty held the knife and fork used to cut the steak. She looked at the empty dinner plate, then swayed her little feet and looked at the direction Katie left with her big eyes. Seeing this, Chen Tao understood immediately. Compared to self-esteem, in Betty's opinion, the next steak is probably more important. If her identity is revealed, Betty won't be able to eat the next steak. Tiu, Bai Yao's eyes lit up slightly, she smiled and said, what a good name. It suits you so well. You shine like the moon. She looked directly at Betty, her eyes full of joy. This look. If Chen Tao hadn't already determined Bai Yao's gender, he would probably have thought that Bai Yao was a Lolita man. Seeing Bai Yao's crazy-like eyes, Chen Tao's other question was solved. Obviously, Betty's pair of twin ponytails is Bai Yao's masterpiece. Chen Tao touched his chin and thought to himself. This Bai Yao is so cold towards men, could it be that she likes women? Chen Tao didn't think too much. He walked towards the direction where Katie left, looked at Bai Yao and Betty, and said, "You guys sit here for a while, I'll go take a look." "Oh," Betty responded. Bai Yao looked directly at Betty, completely too lazy to talk to Chen Tao. Chen Tao entered the house minding his own business. Betty withdrew her gaze and looked at Bai Yao, their eyes facing each other. Betty frowned her slender eyebrows, puffed her cheeks, and said, "Don't stare at me like that. It's disgusting, you know." Bai Yao was startled, then a smile appeared on her face and she said, "You are the first person to say that I am disgusting." Betty felt the hairs on her hair stand on end, and she frowned. Turning his face away from Bai Yao, he said, "I feel even more perverted than Chen Tao, I feel so happy to be scolded for being disgusting." Bai Yao smiled and said, "Well, Betty, if I learn how to fry steak, will you come to my house as a guest?" Betty was stunned. She rolled her eyes, pursed her lower lip, and said, "I'm not interested." Bai Yao looked at Betty and said, "What if it tastes better than Katie's?" "This." Betty pursed her lower lip, lowered her head slightly, and hesitated. Seeing Betty's appearance, the corners of Bai Yao's mouth raised slightly, and he couldn't help but make up his mind to study the cooking method of steak. At the same time, Chen Tao entered the kitchen. The decoration of this kitchen is very reminiscent of Dragon civilization, and their stoves are also different from those on Earth Star. Katie was frying the steak on a frying plate made of white jade. Katie, wearing a nightgown, stood there gracefully. Chen Tao looked at Katie. Katie was facing away from Chen Tao, as if she didn't notice it, and was carefully observing the steak. In this way, Chen Tao can appreciate Katie's figure. Katie has long golden hair that hangs naturally behind her. The gauze skirt clung to her body, her waist was full, and her figure was perfect and graceful. Wearing a pair of white high-heeled boots, she made her already taller even taller. Her skin is as white as cream. The appearance is picturesque. Kadi was the king of the Dragon civilization before. As a king, she has the heroic spirit of a king. But now she is making food seriously, like a virtuous woman. The so-called being able to work in the hall and in the kitchen is talking about a woman like Katie. Chen Tao didn't think much, and slowly approached Katie, put his hands around her waist, came closer, and gently pulled her into his arms. Katie was slightly startled. She turned her face sideways and was very close to Chen Tao's face. Chen Tao came closer and kissed her lips. After a long time, the lips parted. Katie's eyes became a little blurry. She blushed and slowly leaned her little head on Chen Tao's arms. "I miss you so much," Katie said softly. Talking about missing Chen Tao. Chen Tao doesn't come to Longren City often, nor does he often come to see her. It's normal for her to miss Chen Tao. Chen Tao gently hugged Katie, held her little hand, and said, "I plan to go to the fifth universe. It may take some time before I can come back." As he spoke, the surroundings turned into blue codes. Time stopped passing. Katie noticed this and her eyes glowed a little. Chen Tao looked at Katie's delicate eyes and said, "Before I leave, I want to spend time with you. It would be best if I could get you pregnant with the child you have always wanted." Hearing this, Katie blushed twice, turned around slowly, snuggled into Chen Tao's arms, and said, "You have made the soldiers immune to the analysis of the other world, then when you use the other world, treat them, is it also invalid?" Chen Tao said, "If I use the otherworldly function of my own genes, it will indeed be ineffective against them, but I am using nebulas now, so in this world, time is suspended." We have a lot of time to make you pregnant. Get on the kids. Katie's face turned red. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. She gently put her hands around Chen Tao's neck. She looked at him and said, I don't want to do that to get pregnant with a child. I want to know, do you love me or not? She looked directly at Chen Tao, her eyes full of expectation. Chen Tao smiled and hugged Katie. There was a big bed next to him, and he put Katie on the bed. He came closer, the two faces close at hand. Chen Tao held Katie's hand. He looked at her face and said with a smile, believe it or not, I fell in love with you the first time I saw you. I was completely fascinated by you. Katie was startled slightly, her eyes glowed with a hint of luster, and there was a smile on her face. Chen Tao said, so, I love you. Seeing Chen Tao's gentle eyes, Katie took the initiative to hold Chen Tao's neck, raised her face, and kissed Chen Tao. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 256. Chen Tao spent a full week with Katie in this pause time. 1 week later. Chen Tao looked at the blue coat above, and then he looked at Katie beside him. Katie was nestling in Chen Tao's arms, and her big eyes under her eyelashes were full of happiness. Katie didn't have the aura of a king at all now, and she only had the unique cuteness of a little woman. Chen Tao slightly turned sideways, looked at Katie, lifted a few strands of hair on her cheek, put them behind her ears, and then leaned close to her face and kissed her forehead. Katie closed her eyes, her face full of smiles, and slowly hid her body in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, stroked her back, and soothed her little emotions. He said, it's almost time. When Chen Tao said this, Chen Tao could feel Katie in his arms trembling slightly. I guess this sentence is the last thing Katie wants to hear now. Chen Tao looked at Katie and said, I promise I'll be back soon. Katie slowly raised her face, she looked at Chen Tao, and said, well, I'll wait for you. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, scratched her little nose, and said, then, put on your clothes, and your steak, it's been a week, it can't be fuzzy. Katie smiled and said, no. The two got off the bed and tidied up. Chen Tao erased the bed analysis. Time resumed its flow. Katie returned to the stove to prepare the steak. It wasn't long before the steak was ready. Chen Tao walked over, picked up the plate, and said, I'll do it. Katie nodded slightly, she looked at Chen Tao, her eyes full of happiness. The two went out. Seeing Chen Tao coming out with the plate, Betty's eyes lit up slightly, and she smiled. Chen Tao placed a steak in front of Betty, and he also prepared one for himself. Chen Tao took the prepared black pepper sauce and poured it on the steak, and a rich aroma came towards him. His index finger suddenly moved. Chen Tao picked up the knife and fork, slowly cut a piece of beef, and put it into his mouth. The taste was tender and melted in the mouth. This feeling was much better than eating steak on earth. Kati, you are different from before, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao came back to his senses and looked at Bai Yao. Bai Yao was looking at Katie, and Bai Yao had a puzzled look on her face. Katie was slightly startled. She looked at Bai Yao and said, what's different? Bai Yao crossed her arms and said, how should I put it? The words just now, although they look good, give people the feeling that they are like a field that has been abandoned for a long time, without any irrigation, and look lazy and spiritless. And now, you have a woman's breath on you, just like an irrigated field, full of energy. Katie blushed and said, how can this be true? Don't talk nonsense. Bai Yao blinked her eyes. She looked at Katie's blushing face. She seemed to realize something and subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. Bai Yao's face showed a look of realization, as if he was saying, "Oh, so that's it? Bai Yao's eyes are really poisonous. However, it is normal. Katie has been with Chen Tao in this hobby. It is strange that her appearance has not changed at all in this week." Chen Tao looked at Katie. Katie met Chen Tao's gaze. Her face turned slightly red, but she was reluctant to avoid Chen Tao's gaze. Chen Tao smiled at Katie. Katie's face turned redder, and she subconsciously avoided his gaze. Seeing this, Chen Tao retracted his gaze. He looked at Betty, who was enjoying the food. The beef was in her mouth, and the joy and happiness on her face were almost hidden. This girl is really too cute. No wonder even Bai Yao, a cold beauty of the dragon civilization, would be attracted. Katie looked at Betty, then at Chen Tao and said, "Honey, you haven't told us her name yet." "What's her name?" "Her name is Daiwa," Bai Yao answered for Chen Tao. She looked at Katie and said with a smile, "It sounds nice, right? The moon is shining, just like her." Katie looked at Bai Yao, and she couldn't help but blinked and said, "Bai Yao, what are you doing?" Bai Yao was startled, and she looked at the strangeness in Katie's eyes. Bai Yao hurriedly said, "Don't think too much, I just think she is so cute." Katie nodded slightly and said, "Yeah, that's right." Katie retracted her gaze, picked up the knife and fork, and enjoyed her meal. After eating, Chen Tao stood up. Betty also finished eating, and she said, "I want more." Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and he stretched out his hand and hugged Betty horizontally into his arms. Betty was startled. "Don't hug me, put me down. I want more." Chen Tao looked at Betty and said, "If you are naughty again, I will kiss you." Betty was startled. She looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, and she dared not move or be naughty. Chen Tao looked at Katie and Bai Yao and said, "Let's go back to Earth first." "Okay." Katie nodded slightly. Bai Yao crossed his legs, looked at Betty, and smiled, "Little cutie, I will find you next time." Betty was startled. She rolled her eyes at Bai Yao, and was too lazy to pay attention to Bai Yao. Chen Tao carried Betty to base number 1. "Husband." Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao looked at the source of the voice. Ziking, who was wearing a black tights and holding a sniper rifle, was standing there. She seemed to be training. When she saw Chen Tao, Ziking's eyes lit up slightly and a smile appeared on her face. Dear He Yuxuan was also there. Seeing Chen Tao, they smiled. Chen Tao put Betty down. Time stopped. The surroundings turned into blue code. Except for Chen Tao, Ziking and the others were still in the surface world mode and had not entered the inner world. Ziking and He Yuxuan looked around. Ziking looked at Chen Tao and said, "Honey, what's going on?" Suddenly, a micro wormhole appeared next to them. One girl after another walked out of the micro wormhole. Rose was the first to come out. Rose looked around and her eyes fell on Chen Tao. She said, "Honey, what's going on?" She looked a little solemn. I guess Rose thought someone was attacking. Behind Rose were Vera, Philia, Lin, and Fang Sweking. At this time, another wormhole opened and Wu Yao walked out. She looked around and her eyes fell on Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "Don't worry, I'm going to the 5th universe, and I may not be able to come back for a while, so I'll stop this time and spend some time with you." When Rose heard this, her eyes shone with a hint of light, and a smile appeared on her face that was a little serious just now. She crossed her arms and said, "I understand." "Are you going to the 5th universe?" Vera looked a little uneasy. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Dear, that place is very dangerous." "You have to go even if it's very dangerous," Chen Tao said. "I can't forgive what they did, and they must pay the price for it. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 257. Okay, I've decided on this matter. Next, it's time to judge you with that. Chen Tao walked over, hugged Zi Ching and said, then, my dear, you come first bar. Zi Ching's face turned red and she slowly hid her head in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao said, let's go to my room. The girls' faces turned red. Chen Tao is going to the fifth universe. Although it is not difficult for Chen Tao to come back from the fifth universe, who knows if there will be any unexpected situations that may delay time or something. Since you are going on a long trip, of course you have to be gentle and have a good talk with your girls. Chen Tao spent 3 days saying goodbye to the girls during this timeless period. 3 days later, Chen Tao returned to the deck. Zi Ching stood in front of Chen Tao. Behind Zi Ching, standing were the girls. They were looking at this side one by one. Zi Ching stretched out her little hand to straighten Chen Tao's clothes. She looked into Chen Tao's eyes and said, when you come back, don't bring too many sisters with you. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at Zi Ching. Zi Ching's eyes looked at Chen Tao with a hint of luster. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Although Zi Ching said she didn't care about the number of sisters, she would still worry as the number of sisters increased. This is human nature, and Chen Tao can understand it. It is already remarkable that Zi Ching can tolerate Chen Tao adding so many girls to her. Chen Tao wordlessly raised his hand and held Zi Ching's little hand. He slowly stretched out his hand, put his arm around her waist, gently hugged her into his arms, and slowly said in her ear, well, I have you all. I am already satisfied. I promise you, there will not be any more sisters around you. Hearing this, Zi Ching's eyes glowed, and she said softly, I don't want to restrict you, but with more and more sisters, I will be a little afraid. Chen Tao smiled and said, okay, I understand. He kissed Zi Ching's forehead and said, stay at home and remember, don't leave this solar system when I'm not around. Now in this universe, there is no place as safe as the Earth. Zi Ching nodded slightly and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, okay, I'll leave first. Zi Ching said, okay. Chen Tao turned around and looked at Betty. Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, are you leaving now? In Betty's memory, she and Chen Tao had just arrived here. It wasn't long before he was about to leave. This made Betty a little strange. It's not that Betty hasn't considered the other world, but Betty also knows that her clothes have been redefined and should be immune to the analysis of the other world. So Betty didn't think too much at all. She thought Chen Tao was here. After saying goodbye to Zi Ching and the others, she planned to leave. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and touched Betty's little head. Betty frowned, slapped Chen Tao's hand away, and said, what are you doing? I'm not a child, don't touch my head. Chen Tao smiled and said, okay, don't touch her. Then, let's go. As he said that, he stretched out his hand and picked up Betty. As soon as she was picked up, Betty was startled and twisted again, saying, put me down, I'm not a child, don't hug me, I'm going to get angry. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, I'll cook steak for you tonight. Upon hearing this, Betty blinked her eyes, pursed her lower lip, and said, I'll hug you this time, but not next time. Okay. Chen Tao nodded slightly, and the two figures disappeared. Looking at the place where Chen Tao and Betty disappeared. Who is that girl? He Yuxuan couldn't help but look at Zi Ching. Zi Ching shook her head gently and said, I don't know. Could it be my husband's daughter? He Yuxuan asked. Zi Ching shook her head, probably not. If so, my husband would have told me. It may or may not be the case. The child looks about 10 years old. If it were Chen Tao living in the other world. Wu Yao crossed her chest with her hands and touched her chin, it's possible. Zi Ching blinked, but she didn't know what was going on. However, Zi Ching felt that was not the case. If there was a child, She believed that Chen Tao would definitely tell her. It's just that Ziyi Qing doesn't know who the red-haired girl is. Other side. The figures of Chen Tao and Betty appeared in space. Chen Tao looked at the dark space. He entered the gene channel and said, Baiyu. He connected to Baiyu's genetic channel. Master Baiyu's voice came. Chen Tao said, I plan to go to the fifth universe. Do you know where the fifth universe is? I know. Baiyu's soft Lolita tone fell. A miniature wormhole opened, and the petite white jade walked out of the miniature wormhole. Baiyu was as petite as Betty. She was wearing a white gauze dress and a pair of white leather shoes. Her slender legs under the skirt were wrapped in white stockings. A pair of soft snowy hair was tied into twin tails. There was no expression on Baiyu's face, and she was very cold. It's just this outfit, but it's so cute. Seeing the pair of ponytails, Chen Tao blinked and said, Baiyu, you are dressed like this? What's going on? Baiyu said, this is what Baiyao prepared for me. He said that this is the culture of this cosmic civilization. Chen Tao fell into silence. Sure enough, Baiyao is a lolicon. Even the dignified Baiyu King was not spared. Baiyu looked at Chen Tao. If the master doesn't like it, Baiyu can change it back. No, Chen Tao hurriedly said. He touched his nose and said, it's okay, it's pretty good. I'm not a lowly control, am I? No, it's impossible. Chen Tao said to himself in his heart. Chen Tao said, let's talk about business. I want to go to the fifth universe. Do you know the location of the fifth universe? Baiyu nodded slightly and said, of course, I have a data map about the big universe here, but only part of it. The other part is the domain of the universe beast. There is no small universe there, and it is also impossible to conduct reconnaissance and exploration. Chen Tao said, it's not important. The important thing is that I need the map data from here to the fifth universe. Before, Chen Tao planned to go to the map data of the fifth universe. Baiyu nodded slightly and said, okay, I will transmit the map data to you now. Chen Tao thought about it, and he said, wait a moment. Baiyu looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao calmed down. Nebula, I'm thinking about the fifth universe. Do you have data about the larger universe in your database? Received the command, searching. Search completed. Nebula has all the data of the universe where the master is, but no data about the larger universe. Nebula's mechanical voice came slowly. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 258. In fact, Chen Tao had already been mentally prepared. The data that Chen Tao and Nebula asked for before were basically data owned by this universe and not by Nebula in other universes. The performance of the Nebula crushes all civilizations in the entire universe, but it does not seem to have come into contact with civilizations from the outer universe. Very strange. What is going on? If Nebula really comes from the future, how could it be that it has never had contact with civilizations from alien universes? An idea flashed in Chen Tao's mind. Could it be said that in the future where Nebula is located, there will be no invasion from alien universes? Chen Tao has heard of the concept of time. It is said that when things from the future are returned to the past, the future will change accordingly. Maybe in the future where Nebula is, nothing like this happened. Chen Tao shook his head and thought no more. He looked at Baiyu and said, okay, just transfer the data to me. Yes. At this time, Chen Tao could feel that someone was trying to connect to his genetic database, and he agreed. Data entered Chen Tao's database. Chen Tao said, Xingyun, you also make a copy of this data. Instruction received, copying in progress. Copying completed. Chen Tao said, search for the location of the fifth universe in the data. Searching. Search complete. Locate the fifth universe and open a micro wormhole. Positioning completed. The distance is too far to open the micro wormhole. Can't open? Chen Tao frowned slightly. He said, "You can't even do it with your performance. Micro-wormhole transmission cannot be carried out within the cosmic rift. The space in the cosmic rift is unstable. I suggest that the master uses a space-time distortion wormhole." Nebula's mechanical voice came slowly. Hearing this, Chen Tao understood. If the micro-wormhole can be used in the crack between the small universe and the small universe, then Baiyu and the others will not worry about burning out. If you think about it this way, you can understand it. Chen Tao said, "What is a space-time distortion wormhole?" Space-time distortion wormhole creates a wormhole by destroying space and time through space-time distortion. That wormhole can ignore space and time and move. Nebula said slowly. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "Is there any risk?" There are data variables between small universes. Variables cannot be controlled. If such an ultra-long distance movement is carried out, there will be risks and consequences, because the variables are too large to be calculated. Can those data be so large that even Nebula's performance cannot be calculated? Chen Tao originally wanted to use the performance of the nebula to teleport between small universes, but now it seems that it is impossible. Chen Tao said, "Is there any way that can help us reach the fifth universe faster? For now, we just need to break through the barrier of the small universe, go into the gap in the universe, and use flying tools to get on the road." Nebula's voice came. Chen Tao said, "How long will it take?" According to the data map, it will take 50 years to travel to the fifth universe at the fastest speed. Nebula said slowly. 50 years. Chen Tao thought that going to the fifth universe would be a simple matter, but he never expected that it would actually take 50 years. Chen Tao frowned suddenly. Impossible. Why did the people from the fifth universe arrive in our universe in just a few days? Chen Tao clearly remembered that after SDE's death, those who came for revenge came right after. Nebula said slowly, "It is speculated that the other party used the other world." Hearing this, Chen Tao's heart moved and he understood. He suddenly understood. Those guys used the otherworldly abilities of the celestial computer. In fact, when they arrived, it took a long time. The performance of their celestial computer is not as good as that of Nebula, and it is estimated that it will take more than 50 years, and it is likely to be more than 100 years, or even 1,000 years. Just because of the thoughts in the other world, Chen Tao only thought that they only used it for a few days. Chen Tao clenched his fists. 50 years. It was too long, and Chen Tao couldn't bear it. "What's wrong?" A small hand gently held Chen Tao's hand. Chen Tao felt the warmth from his palms. He came back to his senses and looked at Betty in his arms. Betty was looking at Chen Tao with worried eyes. Chen Tao's mood swings affected Betty. Looking at Betty's little face, there was a hint of uneasiness. Looking at Betty's eyes, Chen Tao breathed a sigh of relief. He held Betty's little hand and kissed it. He looked at Betty and said, "Open the space-time distortion wormhole. There are risks. There are risks in using this wormhole." But Chen Tao was never willing to spend 50 years on the road. 50 years is too hard for Chen Tao, and it is too hard for anyone. But the fifth universe must go. Call. A golden circular door appeared in the space. Inside the door can be seen a dark space flashing with thunder and lightning. Looking at this different wormhole in front of me, Baiyu's eyes were filled with luster. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "What is this?" Chen Tao said, "The space-time distortion wormhole. Only through it can we complete the shuttle from this universe to the fifth universe in a short time." Baiyu's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at the door and said, "From our universe to the fifth universe, according to the technology of our Baiyu civilization, it will take at least 1,300 years. I never thought that the technology of your master could be so unique." Chen Tao nodded slightly. "You stay here, Betty, let's go." As he said that, Chen Tao put Betty down, took Betty's hand, and stepped into the wormhole. Chen Tao felt a black screen in front of his eyes. It lit up again. This feeling was the same as entering a micro wormhole, and the difference was not big. Chen Tao found that the environment around him had changed. There were tall buildings all around, but unlike the buildings on Earth, these tall buildings were all made of machinery, and even the ground was made of machinery. The tall buildings emitted lights, and the light illuminated the surroundings. The sky in this place was dark, without stars or moon. Chen Tao also noticed that he was on the street, and there were people coming and going on the street, but each of these people was wearing a black tights and black armor. After they noticed Chen Tao and Betty, they all looked over here. Although they couldn't see their appearance because of their helmets, Chen Tao could feel that they were looking at him. Chen Tao didn't care about this. He said, "Nebula, are we there?" "We are here." "Master, you are now on a planet in the fifth universe," a mechanical voice came. Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly, and his heart was relieved. "It's a metal problem. I feel really uncomfortable," Betty's voice came. Chen Tao looked at the lovely Betty, and he smiled with a little excitement. He raised his hand, picked Betty up, and kissed her cheek hard. "Ah! What are you doing? Don't hug me, put me down." Betty's face was as red as clouds, and her big eyes rolled at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and put Betty down. "Really, what are you doing?" Suddenly, Betty wiped her cheek with her hand and said, "You made my face full of saliva." Swish. Suddenly, Chen Tao heard footsteps. He looked and saw a group of men in black with guns running over and suddenly surrounded Chen Tao and Betty. The muzzles of their guns were pointed at Chen Tao and Betty. Chen Tao was slightly startled, his eyebrows slightly relaxed, and he looked around. "Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you not wearing isolation suits?" At this time, a woman wearing a tights and a helmet came out riding a mechanical mount, staring coldly at Chen Tao and the others. "You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 259. Isolation suit? Are those they wear called isolation suits? Chen Tao looked at the woman and said calmly, "This should be a question of my doubts. Your planet is so strange. Everyone wears that kind of clothes. Why?" The woman frowned, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Planet? Who are you?" Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at the woman, and said, "We are visitors from other universes. My name is Chen Tao, and the one next to me is called Betty." The woman's eyebrows slightly stretched and she said, "I don't care which universe you come from. If you are on our planet and you don't wear the isolation suits we require, please leave this planet immediately." Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at the woman and said, "What is the purpose of this isolation suit? Why do you need to wear it?" The woman said calmly, "You came to our planet, but you don't know anything? In our universe, all the stars have undergone mutations, the amount of radiation has increased greatly, and all planets with life are no longer suitable for humans. Survive. Only by wearing an isolation suit will the body cells be unaffected." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "You too continue to expose your cells to the air. Soon, you too will know what death is. Detecting radiation levels in the air. Detecting. The test results show that the radiation content in the air is 10,000 times that of the Earth. Normal people's cells will rupture and die in an instant under this kind of radiation. Even the second-generation genetic warriors cannot survive this high-intensity radiation for an hour." Xingyun's voice slowly sounded in Chen Tao's mind. No wonder this planet is all made of metal, with no smell of plants at all." The woman raised her hand, threw 2 sets of isolation suits to Chen Tao and Betty, and said, "Put them on and follow me." Chen Tao looked at the woman and said, If you are worried about our lives, then just rest assured that our bodies are special and this level of radiation will not have any impact on us. He threw the isolation gown to the woman. The woman took it. She looked at Chen Tao and then at Betty. She frowned and said, "Okay, follow me." As she spoke, the woman pulled the reins in her hands. Riding under the woman's crotch was a mechanical mount shaped like a horse. The mechanical horse turned its body. The woman looked at Chen Tao and Betty and said, "Sit up." Chen Tao looked at the scene and said, "No need." The ring on his finger shone slightly, turned into a white light and fell behind him, and a pair of pure white wings suddenly appeared. He flapped his wings and flew up. The dragon wings behind Betty also stretched out and flew up. Seeing this, the woman's eyes were filled with the slightest surprise, and she started running on the mechanical horse. Chen Tao and Betty followed. Betty looked at the woman below, then looked at Chen Tao and said, "Hey, what are we going to do with her?" Chen Tao crossed his hands on his chest and said, "I am now trying to eradicate the people who come to the Earth Star to cause trouble, that is, to eradicate the believers of STE, but now if we want to look for it, we can't find it all at once. We can only collect it slowly. Information. Maybe the woman in front of me knows something." Hearing this, Betty snorted and said, "Okay. There is a high-tech metal building ahead." The woman got off the mechanical horse. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "That's my residence over there." With that said, the woman walked to the door, and once she reached the door, scanning human body radiation levels. A red light fell above the woman, scanning the woman's body from top to bottom. Nothing unusual. A mechanical sound sounded. The metal-like door slowly opened. The woman entered the gate. She looked at Chen Tao and Betty. She crossed her arms and said, "Scan it. If your bodies are not affected by the radiation, you will be fine." Hearing this, Chen Tao and Betty looked at each other. Chen Tao landed at the door and folded his wings. Red light fell on Chen Tao. Scanning radioactivity. Nothing unusual. Seeing this, the woman's eyes glowed slightly. At this time, Betty also fell behind. "I scanned it again, nothing unusual." The woman nodded slightly and said, "Please come in." The woman entered the house. Chen Tao and Betty followed and walked in. Upon entering, Chen Tao discovered that this was a living room with a sofa and a TV. Although the style was different from that in Dixing, the furnishings were similar. Although they are in different universes and different planets, some places are still the same. "Sit down as you like, I'll excuse you for a moment," the woman said, minding her own business and entering the back room. Chen Tao sat down on the sofa. Betty also sat down and looked around. Looking at Betty's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you surprised?" Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, "What's the surprise?" "Although this is a different universe and a different planet, the furnishings here are not much different from ours," Chen Tao said. Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "This is normal. In our universe, those planetary civilizations are not connected, but within those planetary civilizations, chairs, tables, and TVs will all appear one by one with the influence of the timeline. Genes. The brains of living creatures are similar and their needs are similar, so the things that appear are naturally similar." "Nothing to be surprised about," Betty said lightly. Watching the red-haired lowly talking casually, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed and thought for a while. Chen Tao found that it was indeed the case. "Sorry for the wait." Suddenly, a voice came. Chen Tao raised his head and saw a scene that made Chen Tao slightly startled. A woman in a black tights came out. Her helmet was gone, and her long white hair was naturally draped behind her. Her face was delicate and perfect. She was tall, with a tight waist, amazing bust, and her legs were extremely slender. Her figure was impeccable, and her appearance was impeccable. The woman came over by herself and sat on the sofa. She crossed her legs and looked over here. You claim to be visitors from another universe, so what do you plan to do in our universe? The woman looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at the woman and said, before asking, can I know your name first? The woman heard it and said, I am the ruler of this planet, Ming. The ruler of this planet? Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at the woman and said, in other words, you are the king of this planet. You can say that. The woman crossed her arms, leaned against the back of the chair, and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, I think the civilization of your planet should belong to the aerospace civilization. I believe this civilization is enough to dominate this universe. In this case, I believe you should know something about this universe. Do you know stir? Ming looked at Chen Tao and said, stir? Are you talking about the god of the universe who died for more than 3,000 years, stir? Hearing this, Chen Tao's heart condensed slightly. 3,000 years. Chen Tao felt that all the hairs on his body stood up. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 260. Chen Tao can be sure that Stir's death happened recently. But Ming said that Stir had been dead for 3,000 years. Could it be? Chen Tao was secretly shocked and said to Xingyun in his heart, Stir has been dead for 3,000 years. Yes, when you passed through the time-space distortion wormhole, time was distorted, and you arrived at your destination 3,000 years later. Xingyun's mechanical voice sounded slowly. Listening to Xingyun's emotionless voice, Chen Tao's face turned pale and his hands covered his head. He wanted to be angry, but he had no choice. After all, Xingyun had said that time-space distortion wormholes are risky. But, it has been 3,000 years, so is there any point for him to come here? 3,000 years is enough time for many, many things to happen. This fifth universe is probably not the fifth universe that he wants to deal with. And now, let alone dealing with the problems of the fifth universe, it is estimated that the universe where Chen Tao is located has undergone earth-shaking changes. 3,000 years have passed, so is there any point for Chen Tao to come to the fifth universe now? Suddenly, Chen Tao's mind flashed. Time machine. By the way, now we can use the time machine to go back to 3,000 years later. Thinking of this, Chen Tao said, Xingyun, use the time machine, I want to go back to 3,000 years later. There is no time data of the fifth universe, so the time machine cannot be used. Xingyun's mechanical voice came. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's face changed slightly. What do you mean? Cannot be used. Hello. Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao came back to his senses, and he looked at Betty beside him. Betty was looking at Chen Tao with her big eyes, her eyes were shining, and said, Are you okay? There was worry in Betty's eyes. Looking at the worry in the little face in front of him, he looked at his hand, which was held by Betty's little hand, because Betty's little hand was too small, and could only hold one of Chen Tao's thumbs. But Chen Tao could feel Betty's concern. Seeing Betty's expression, Chen Tao said, 3,000 years. Hearing this, Betty said, I heard it. Chen Tao said, then you don't feel anything. Betty said, what can I feel? Don't forget, I have lived for millions of years. Thousands of years make no difference to me. And in my opinion, the most important person to me is you. You are by my side, so it doesn't matter what happens to others. She looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, with a look of indifference on her face. Looking at Betty's calm expression, Chen Tao also calmed down a little. He gently stroked Betty's hair and slowly held her in his arms. Chen Tao looked at Ming in front of him. Ming's eyes were shining with a hint of light, and his eyes were staring at Chen Tao. Seeing Chen Tao looking at him, Ming subconsciously opened his mouth and said, You came here from 3,000 years ago. Chen Tao said, well, there was an accident on the way here, and it seemed to take 3,000 years to get here. Well, 3,000 years, Ming looked at Chen Tao and said, if you are here to find stir, then give up, he has been dead for a long time. Chen Tao said, I know, then let me ask you, do you know the dragon civilization and the earth? Ming looked at Chen Tao, dragon civilization, do you mean the dragon civilization of the first universe? The first universe, Chen Tao was slightly startled, he looked at Betty, and then looked at Ming, there is also a dragon civilization in the first universe. Ming crossed his arms and said, of course there is. The first universe was just a small universe with no reputation 3,000 years ago. Later, the sixth generation of genes appeared in it. Many people from many universes went to challenge it, but they all died. Later, it became more and more famous, and now it is the well-deserved first universe. Chen Tao felt that all the hairs on his body stood up. The sixth generation of gene bodies, dragon civilization. Isn't what Ming is talking about Chen Tao's universe? Chen Tao slowly stood up, he looked at Ming and said, thank you for your explanation, I think we should leave. Leave. Ming looked at Chen Tao and said nothing. Chen Tao took Betty to the door, he looked at Ming and said, in view of your help to me, I will give you a gift. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Snap. A crisp sound. Chen Tao looked at Ming and said, your body has been transformed. From now on, you can be exposed in the universe like us, and nothing will happen. Ming was slightly startled, and she slowly stood up. Chen Tao took Betty out of the door. Chen Tao said, Nebula, open the space-time distortion wormhole. A golden door appeared in front of Chen Tao, looking at the dark time of the door. 3,000 years have been missed, and Chen Tao doesn't care what he is missing. He took Betty's hand and stepped into the space-time distortion wormhole. Chen Tao felt a black and bright in front of his eyes. Chen Tao looked around. This is a familiar place, this is in Yuehu Manor. I'm back. Chen Tao looked around, Yuehu Manor has not changed at all, but Chen Tao can see that the society outside Yuehu Manor is already full of tall buildings, and those tall buildings are all black metal plates with blue light. It gives people a high-tech feeling, and in the sky, there is a huge spaceship flying over those tall buildings. Seeing this, Chen Tao said, Xingyun, tell me, has anything changed this time? No change. Hearing this, Chen Tao breathed a sigh of relief. Master, a familiar voice came from beside him. Chen Tao turned around and saw a familiar figure. It was number 10. Number 10 was still the same as before, with a smile on his face. As expected of an artificial person. Chen Tao nodded slightly and said, 3,000 years have passed, are Ziking and the others doing well now? Hearing this, number 10 had doubts in her eyes. She looked at Chen Tao and said, Master, what are you talking about? Hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled, what? Number 10 said, aren't you always here? Chen Tao was startled, what do you mean? Number 10 said, according to my database, you have been by our side for 3,000 years and have never left. Chen Tao was stunned. What does it mean? Someone pretended to be him and was with Ziking and the others. No, this is impossible. Kadi and Vilya, with their intelligence, how could they not tell whether the other party was real or fake? And to pretend to be a person with the sixth generation gene body in the known universe is simply a daydream. Unless. Chen Tao said, Nebula, check if there is another nebula in this universe. Received the command, testing. The test was successful, and there is a data fluctuation of the second nebula in the universe.